Well, what's up, Colliders? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and another Fast and Furious movie is racing into theaters. Fast 10. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So in many ways, the Fast and Furious franchise is kind of akin to that used car that you buy from the lot, just sort of hoping you're going to get a couple of good years out of it. And then, hey, you wake up 20 years later, you're still driving that car. So this series started way back in 2001. And hard to believe that about 20 years later, we have the 10th entry in this franchise. So while it's obviously be commended for the achievements of hanging on this long, at least to me, Fast 10 kind of suggests that the finish line is, or at least should be, not too far off. So let me just say kind of from the start, disclaimer, that I have an unapologetic love for just sort of terrible European heavy metal with singers that dress like knights and sing about dragons. Hey, you like what you like. Obviously, a lot of people like this franchise. A lot of people, the fact that there's 10 of these movies, they keep making money. Hey, there's no shame in that if this is sort of your jam. I am not one of those people. This movie, these types of movies, just aren't the ones that kind of get my engines going. So maybe I'm biased against this movie, but at least to me, despite the fact that there is some good thrills, there's some good laughs, it's kind of surprisingly wholesome themes and kind of little nuggets of dialogue scattered throughout it. Kind of despite that, this movie really is sort of an embodiment of why these sorts of movies and this franchise just doesn't really do it for me, because kind of overall, this movie is mostly kind of this silly, big, bloated mess. But let's start, before we get into some of the problems with this film, let's start with the positives. Again, these films do things well. That's why people like these movies. And obviously, the one thing that a Fast and Furious movie has to do well is car chases. They got to drive fast. They got to drive furiously. And in this movie, the scenes are competently well done. They are exciting, even as they get kind of increasingly outlandish and just sort of way fantastical, over the top, just trying to, hey, there's only so much you can do with racing cars. You got to try and think outside the box how to make it exciting. But hey, they do get you sort of your adrenaline going. There are some good kind of car chase action scenes in this. Jason Momoa, Mr. Aquaman, is the villain in this movie. And kind of from across the board, he's been getting a lot of positive feedback, kind of praise for his performance. I think there are some aspects of his character that we'll get into in just a minute that might make it him less accessible or enjoyable for Christian audiences. But that being said, he is entertaining. He does sort of add some charisma, some energy to his scenes in a movie that desperately needs just some of that kind of extra energy. And like I said, there are wholesome themes. There are just sort of this positive sort of message of family, and characters like Vin Diesel and sort of the rest of his family, his crew, are sort of this like dispensing these like snappy, wise proverbs and kind of life coach, advice. Like there are these sages on top of the mountaintop. So there are some good things going on in this film. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of not good things that are kind of going on in the film. I think, like kind of at least the last set of kind of iteration of this franchise, the film is very clearly self-aware of its own silliness. It knows the type of film it is. It knows it's over the top. It's not trying to hide that or be bashful of the fact that it is this a deeply silly film. Although at least in this one, it kind of veers over that solid yellow line on the road into just the lane of parody. It is hard at times to get invested in the stakes that clearly this film is trying to establish. These big stakes and characters are dying, and it's a lot going on, and it's just hard to really get invested when so many of these scenes kind of come across more like a Saturday Night Live sketch of Fast and Furious, rather than a movie that you can kind of find yourself taking seriously on its own. But perhaps the biggest issue in this movie is that there's just so many characters and subplots that are largely kind of undeveloped. New characters seem to pop up in this like every couple scenes, and a lot of these new characters are actually old characters from earlier in the 10 movie series. And a lot of these new characters, actually kind of old characters that are showing up from later in the series. And even the plot just quickly becomes very repetitive. It kind of repeats the same beat over and over where, hey, the heroes find Momoa's character. They have some kind of clever, witty banter. They fight or they race and kind of gain the upper hand. And then, oh, plot twist, Momoa's character has some secret, devilish plot that they didn't see coming. He outmaneuvers them, and then they move on to the next location. Then you sort of rinse and repeat. And they do that same kind of story structure probably about 4 times in this film. So it does begin to feel very repetitive, especially with how long this movie is. And the main cast, sort of the family in this film, is kind of split into 4 distinct groups and kind of parallel subplots. But really only Van Diesel, sort of the A plot, has any real significance to this film, where kind of all the other characters really just kind of aimlessly wander. They're all trying to kind of get back to sort of this rendezvous point, although none of them in this film ever arrive at that point. And this film, the runtime of this film is about 2.5 hours, and it feels like for most of that, probably about an hour and a half of that, it is definitely spinning its wheels, just trying to fill up the space by coming up with new subplots and material rather than just sort of focusing on what's going on. And then the biggest plot twist of this whole thing that I just didn't know going in is that this movie ends sort of jarringly right in the middle of the climax. Big cliffhanger, which is crazy in a movie that's over 2.5 hours that feels bloated. Apparently there is a part 2. I was not aware of that. This thing is gonna keep going. And hey, props to the ambition of that. But such a simplistic film that already feels like it's just sort of spinning its wheels, kind of trying to reach like that epic, scope of like the Dune movies, ends up being an overreach, and it makes this actual film just leaving the theater feel super unsatisfying and just incomplete. So as far as content to consider, the kind of things going on in the surface of this language, there is plenty of kind of scattered profanity all throughout this film. I personally didn't hear an F-bomb used in this, which is a rarity these days for a PG-13 film, although many of the characters in this film speak in these like gravelly mumbles, so I might have missed one, but I think mostly it's sort of more minor profanities, although they are quite frequent throughout this. Violence, there is plenty of violence and action in this, although most of it isn't necessarily depicted like on screen or in focus. Characters die and explosions, and countless cars get smashed in totals, and presumably the drivers did not make it out of that encounter, but you don't actually see close-ups of that. Characters get bloody through like fights and brawls, but nothing kind of over the top in that way. Probably the only thing that would come to mind as being kind of gratuitous and over the top is that Momoa's character sort of at one point, he has these 2 corpses of henchmen that didn't quite make it, and he's positioned them almost like they're dolls, and he's having this like tea party, and he's like taped their eyes open and their mouths, and they just sort of look like something from a horror movie, and he's sort of talking to them, and he's like painting their toenails, and it's this weird scene. Like a fly lands on one of their eyes, and again, it is sort of this like darkly comedic scene, but it definitely feels more like a horror vibe that is in contrast to sort of the rest of the tone of this film. Sexuality, there is one scene that takes place at like a drag race, and there's a bunch of people watching the race and partying and dancing, and a lot of characters sort of they're all dancing in very tightly fitting, skin revealing outfits, and the camera does seem to delight in like sort of these gratuitous like close-up shots of like the backside of the female characters or like the bare midriffs or any of that. So you do get some of that, although it is mostly sort of in that one scene. Kind of the other thing as far as sexuality goes, although Jason Momoa's character, his sexuality in this film is not ever directly addressed, it's heavily implied that he is a gay character, or at least a very like flamboyant kind of character, which becomes mostly his like defining trait of who he is sort of this outwardly kind of playing around with sexuality. So that is very much present kind of all throughout this film as well. As far as themes, kind of things going on kind of beneath the surface of this, although not too far beneath the surface, it is not hard to see some of the stuff going on. But one of the interesting things, at least approaching this movie as a Christian, is this how central and prominent like religious motifs and language plays a role in this film. Kind of the conflict between Van Diesel's Dominic and Jason Momoa's character, whose name is Dante, is very much framed as sort of this like biblical holy war between good and evil. Dante is described directly by one of the other characters as the devil, and even his name Dante may be an intentional kind of symbolism to Dante's Inferno, and kind of again tying him to that kind of devilish, hellish motif. One of his early sort of parts of his master plan is to try and blow up the Vatican, which he tells his henchmen is going to result in them going to hell. So very much kind of all throughout this, framing him as sort of this like devilish embodiment of evil, where in contrast, Dominic Van Diesel's character is kind of established as the antithesis to that. He is sort of this Christ figure. He carries around like a crucifix, this necklace that he wears that obviously has a deep kind of spiritual meaning for him, and he's sort of constantly making these like speeches about the importance of faith, and even the film itself sort of establishes that like his driving ambition or motivation is to save everyone. And kind of Dante in one scene, one banter that they have, gives him a lecture about what it takes to become a saint and sort of the self-sacrificial element of that. So it does sort of establish on like a wider metaphorical level that this is sort of biblical motifs and religious imagery is woven kind of all throughout this. But even maybe on a more direct level, although kind of Dominic is essentially sort of the Christ figure, he's like the Jesus of this film in a metaphorical sense. The film also hints that he has some, at least, connection or belief in a higher power. And the film doesn't necessarily probe that spiritual belief with much depth beyond sort of just inspirational platitudes. Like he makes comments like nothing is impossible. You just have to have faith. And in the film, it's never super clear. Kind of what, if anything, is like the object, like the subject of that worship or of that belief. They talk a lot about faith, but they don't necessarily talk about God, or you don't really see them like praying, just sort of belief, which maybe can be seen in more of like a humanistic, just sort of faith in humanity and in good people. Although there is enough in this film to establish that, hey, he does have some sense of sort of the divine or of a God, or kind of however you take that. The crucifix is sort of this symbol all throughout this film that symbolizes that kind of that deeper connection. Even his wife in this, the character played by Michelle Rodriguez, kind of they're in bed together talking, and even kind of while focusing on the crucifix, she tells me, she says, "You know what you miss if you keep looking through the rear view mirror, eternity." So there very much is, almost in contrast, this thing like a John Wick franchise, where God is like noticeable by being completely absent from that whole kind of fictional world. At least in Fast and Furious movie, even if they don't explore it in much depth, there is a sense that there is a God out there, that these characters have some kind of connection to him. So in the end, I suspect, hey, we're in movie number 10. You probably have your own, you've already decided, you know what to expect, you know what you're going to get out of this. I do expect that fans that are a bit more like invested in like the lore of these 10 movies will probably enjoy it more than I did, because in many ways this is sort of like this greatest hits kind of album of the series, where characters from all across and plot lines kind of all come together, and they allude to things that happened in earlier films. And so there is a lot of that stuff to hopefully kind of appease longtime fans. Although I do also suspect that even many that have been kind of along for this whole ride may start feeling some fatigue, just sort of the repetition. This is kind of the scope, the ambition that I think maybe has finally kind of outpaced what really started as a very simplistic premise. But hey, let me know what you guys think. If you enjoyed this more, if this lived up to the hype, if you're excited for the part 2 of this, or if you're like me and you're just sort of ready to put this car to rest, go get a new one, and move on with our life and keep those memories, let me know in the comment section. We'd love to have a conversation with you on that. And if you haven't done so, encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. A lot of other movies and live streams and this other stuff we're doing here. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.